Hello, and welcome to the second of your lectures on Theorising Social Life, the first of the virtual ones. We'll make our way through the series of theorists, looking at major theorists. So the principal theorists we'll look at today will be primarily an American sociologist called Talcott Parsons, who had a significant influence on structural functionalism. But we'll also include a little bit of Karl Marx, some Max Weber, and a soupçon of Emile Durkheim as we go along. There are, of course, lots of other theorists out there, but we'll get onto those in future weeks. This is just today's selection. So, chap in the photograph here with the slightly wonky moustache is Talcott Parsons, who, as you can see, has popped his clogs in '79. So he's a massive influence on the sociology of the first half, almost first three quarters even, of the 20th century. Very, very influential writer. And obviously not everybody agrees with everything he says, as is always the case with anything, but nonetheless a very influential thinker and writer, and very prolific. He wrote a phenomenally large number of journal articles and papers and books and one thing and another. He came from a strongly Christian background and remained a devout Christian for his life. That had a significant influence on his thinking and his theories, which you may be able to discern little bits of that as we go along. You don't yourself have to be a Christian in order to agree with his views or take value from them, but it'll help you to understand his views, to bear some of that in mind. Like a lot of the sociologists of the 19th and early 20th century, he was very keen on developing grand narratives, that is to say, big massive theories that try to explain everything in society. That's less common these days, when most contemporary sociologists tend to concentrate on the smaller picture and developing a theory to explain one element of society, rather than to try and explain the lot. But in previous centuries it was more encouraged to go for the big grand theories. So in terms of some of his ideas, he was a structural functionalist. That is to say, he looked at the various social structures in society, things like the church, the media, schools, the law, the various branches of the military, of government, politics and so forth, and asked himself, what function do these structures, these social constructs and hierarchies serve? And he asked that in a number of different contexts. So he started out by thinking, well, what was their original intention when they were first set up? So kind of looking at the historical background to institutions. When they first started, what were they aiming to achieve? And X many years down the line, are they still achieving it? Have they changed direction and are now achieving something quite different from what they set out to do, serving a different kind of a function? Or have they lost all function at all, and kind of like museum pieces, they just plod on, not really serving any useful function to society, but still in existence, perhaps because they self-perpetuate, perhaps out of some vague notion of nostalgia, or whatever else. They just kind of burble on forevermore. So some structures he saw as serving a very vital function, and other structures he saw as having largely lost their function, or occasionally having sort of subverted or diverted their function into completely unexpected areas, going off at different tangents. And so we could, and indeed I'm sure we will do when we meet up in class, sit and reflect on the possible functions of some of these things you've got on the screen here, or there may be other structures in society you're more interested in the function of. What do they do? What do they achieve? How do they achieve it? How do they go about serving the function? Now, the function is the benefit they have to wider society. So in looking at the function of the church, it's not simply how the church serves a function within and of itself, in other words, to its worshippers, to its priests, bishops and so forth, but also what function the church serves in wider society, which will include atheists, agnostics, Muslims, Jews, Hindus, Buddhists, pagans, and the rest of it. So people who may themselves not go to church may nonetheless be influenced by, for good, for ill, for indifferent, the functions of the church within wider society. Likewise, you don't have to be in school yourself to derive some benefit, or possibly occasionally some annoyance, from the function of schools. So a school doesn't only function for the children in it and the teachers and the caretakers and the dinner ladies and so on. It also has a function in wider society, and so forth for all of the others. So it's Parsons' point of view is to reflect on all of these different aspects of the functions that things serve. And whilst he did say, as already mentioned, that some things last much longer than they really ought to, and even though they no longer serve any function, they're still kind of staggering on, he did feel that in the long run, losing your function would lead to the extinction of the structure. It might take a while, it might continue on for a few years or maybe even a century or two, long after it's served to be of any use to anyone. But eventually, once it ceases to be of use, it will just dwindle and dwindle and dwindle until it's gone entirely. He was quite influenced by ideas that originated with Tonniès, who we mentioned last week, talking about Gesellschaft and Gemeinschaft. And he took Tonniès' ideas and sort of ran with them and developed them and explored them in different contexts. So hopefully you'll flash back to last week and you'll remember that Gemeinschaft society is one in which there's a sort of a healthy collectivism. People feel part of a society, they support each other, they look after each other. It's quite upbeat, quite jolly, quite interactive, and people feel a sense of belonging and so forth. A Gesellschaft society, as originally described by Tonniès, is one in which that community spirit has largely broken down, or possibly never even existed in the first place, but has gone to the wall. And so what you get instead is a stronger tendency to individualism, which can be very good for some people, but also individualism often comes at the cost of feeling isolated, feeling lonely and cut off, and not having anyone to turn to and so on. So there's good and bad in both sides. In a Gemeinschaft society, because you're very aware of the collective, that can sometimes stifle individualism. So there is good and bad to be had in both accounts. So part of what Parsons started to think about in terms of how he understood and how he applied these ideas of Gesellschaft and Gemeinschaft was to think in terms of the agent. Now, hopefully you will flash back to your first year and the lectures you had around agency and structure. Just in case that's all gone a bit blurry over the summer, agency is your personal choice. Free will, to a point at least, where you can exercise your choice over what you do, where you do it, when you do it, how you do it, so on and so forth. Whether we're talking about buying food in a supermarket, or whether we're talking about life-changing career choices or decisions over who to marry or even if to marry, that kind of thing. All kinds of choice that you might potentially exert in your life can be classed as agency. Structure are the grand social forces that don't only affect you as an isolated individual, but affect lots and lots of other people who are similar to you in some capacity. And which, rather like a tide in the ocean or a current in a river, tend to sweep people along in a certain direction. It is possible to paddle in the opposite direction, but that takes a lot of effort. And Tonniès and Parsons and various other people have suggested that it's easier to get swept along than it is to paddle against the current. So usually the kinds of structures that most sociologists these days are interested in tend to be things like social class, gender, ethnicity, sexuality, all those big buzzwords that get bandied around these days, where it's not just you as an individual person who might be a woman or a man, it's you and umpty million other women, you and umpty million other men. So forces that affect large numbers of people because of the kind of person they are in some shape, form or another. So, returning to the point of agency in that first box there on the screen, does the agent become emotionally involved? In a Gesellschaft society, a very individualistic society, there's a lot of self-gratification, which you might just take in the wrong way, hopefully you won't. You exist to please yourself, to be emotionally involved with yourself, your own choices, your own decisions. You do things to please yourself primarily, first and foremost. Whereas in a Gemeinschaft society, there is a wish to consider others. Yes, you will like to please yourself and do things you like doing, but you'll also be thinking about pleasing other people. And so Parsons' argument is that you tend to be not quite as emotionally involved in the sorts of choices you make and the sorts of decisions, because it's not so much about me as it is about us, and what's good for us as a group, like your family, for example, or your tribe or your village or whatever level of collectivity we're talking about. Whose interests take precedence? Well, we kind of just answered that already. In the Gesellschaft society, you come first and foremost. In a Gemeinschaft society, other people, your family and so forth, come first. And you think about them and what's important for them. And if there is a conflict between self and individual, i.e. what you want isn't what they want, then in the Gesellschaft society, what you want normally comes first, whereas in a Gemeinschaft society, what they want normally comes first. Let's put that in a realistic term. In the issue of romance and marriage, in a Gesellschaft society like 21st century Britain, you choose who you marry, who you fall in love with. You might ask for advice from your parents, from your brothers, sisters, whoever else, but it's only advice. You are no longer asking their permission to go and get married to so-and-so person. Whereas certainly in the Victorian era, and still today in many parts of the world, arranged marriages are more common, Gemeinschaft society, and so either the parents arrange the marriage for you, or even if you are the one to find the person that you fall in love with, or at least are prepared to put up with, even if you don't love them necessarily, you would consult with parents, brothers, sisters, grandparents, aunts, uncles, and say, can this person become part of our family? Can they become part of our tribe? And should the family say, no, absolutely not, they're awful, then even if you felt a great longing for them, most of the time you would go with the family decision. There are occasions where people elope and they run off to wherever they're going to run off to in order to marry their beloved, but in the process they are very estranged from their families. So that's an example of a strongly Gemeinschaft society, which is a heavily institutionalized society in many ways, and of the much more individualistic society. And you might have your own views, so far at least, as to which one you would prefer to live in if you had an option in the matter. So in terms of what guides given actions in a particular situation, a particular circumstance, for the individualist society, the Gesellschaft society, you have ideals, concepts, universalism. Let's take a topical example. Hopefully this won't upset people, but we'll take a topical example. The whole BLM, Black Lives Matter movement that's been very prominent in the news the last couple of few months is arguing, or one of the things it is arguing at any rate, is this notion of justice for absolutely everybody. So whether you're black, white, Asian, Chinese, whatever you might be ethnicity-wise, that you are treated in the same way by the police force and by extension other institutions like the courts and so forth, by government. So everyone is treated in a fair principle. So the same ideal, justice, applies equally to all and sundry. And of course you could not only argue that in terms of race, you could argue it in terms of your sex, your social class, your religion, or all sorts of other things you could argue that in terms of. Gemeinschaftssociety tends to run on quite a strong degree of very overt particularism, which is another way of saying favouritism, that there will be certain groups to which you owe an allegiance and to whom you are supposed to show particular favour, more so than you would to a stranger who is not in your group. And that's not necessarily... Well, there are examples where it has been to do with race, like in South Africa during the apartheid period. But by and large, most of the examples in the world, both current and historical, have not been so much about race as they have been about which local tribe you come from, which caste you're a part of in Indian society, for example, involves a lot of particularism. Whether, even down to the kind of level of is someone from Suffolk or Norfolk, or maybe even are they from our village or that other horrible village 10 miles up the road, involves quite a strong degree of particularism, where you are meant to show favouritism to your own group and you're considered quite antisocial if you don't. So in some cultures, for example, if you are stealing or cheating, sort of fiddling money from outsiders, people who are not local, people from far away, which could simply be 10 miles up the road, of course, then that's okay. But it would be considered very immoral indeed if you were seen to be cheating, stealing from, fiddling money off of people within your own group. So you don't rob from your own, but it's okay to rob from somebody else, an outsider. That sort of attitude. So it's not the same, it's not the idea of justice for all, it's justice for our lot. The other lot, well, who cares about them? Justice for our lot. Honesty for our lot. Fair treatment for our lot, rather than other people, other groups, outside groups. In terms of the relationship between an individual and the social roles they have, in Gesellschaft, individualist society, you achieve what you achieve, and you take pride in that as an individual. So come your graduation day, when you're stood there in your mortarboard and gown and waving your certificate in the air, there will be a real sense, or hopefully, that you have achieved this. It's your hard work, your effort, your writing essays and ploughing through books and doing all of the things you've got to do to get your graduation. And yes, your family will, well, hopefully, take pride in you and take photos of you and all that kind of thing. But primarily, this will be your achievement and something you have to work for, rather than something that is given to you. Where in the Gemeinschaftssociety, roles often go within families and are handed down in families. So in ancient Greece, for example, a lot of the temples, the high priest or the high priestess would be a relative, son, daughter, nephew, niece, whatever, of the previous high priest or high priestess. And so it wasn't necessarily that a complete stranger, unrelated, could work very, very hard and rise up the ranks and become a high priestess, but rather that within the family you'd be raised and trained in the job from a very young age, and so naturally you would go into that role when you were old enough to attain to it. Likewise, up until very, very recently in British society, a great many jobs and trades passed down within the family. So if your dad was a carpenter, you would be a carpenter. If your mum was a baker, you would be a baker. You would be raised to do the family trade and follow in the family job, whether you were working class, middle class or upper class. So if Dad was a doctor, you'd be a doctor. If your mother was a duchess, you would, in your turn, one day become a duchess. Or duke, depending. So the kind of the inheriting of roles from past generations within either your family unit or some other larger extended unit. And the expectation that you'll do that whether you want to or not. It's not a matter of personal enjoyment or personal ambition. It's simply what you are expected to do. And last on this particular grid, Parsons was interested in this idea of the nature of the relationship between two agents, i.e. two people, each with their own free will. It says within an individualist society, like the one we live in, there is frequently a task focus. So two people meet up and they're focused on what they have in common, and what they have in common primarily is what they're trying to do or achieve. So take your own examples. Think of the other students in your class. Would you have ever met them? And I do realise that in one case we've got blood relation, but that aside, would you have ever met the majority of people in your class had you not both been in the class? Now, I suppose you might have passed them in the street or walked past them in a shop or something, but would you have stopped? Would you have said hello? Would you have got to know them? It's primarily the fact that you're all in the same class, studying the same subjects, sharing resources, bouncing ideas off each other. That's what you're focused on. And if along the way you get to like each other, that's an added bonus. But primarily you're there for the focus on the task. Likewise, for those of you who are in employment, people you work with, you are there to do a job with them. You're not there because you really, really like them. I mean, you might actually like them, but again, that's an added bonus rather than something you set out to achieve. And so you can work with people you don't like, you can work with people you're totally indifferent to, or work with people you really like. All of those are possibilities within the work environment because you're mostly focused on what you want to achieve or attain. Whether that's a course that goes on for 3 years or whether that's the 2 minutes it takes you to queue up at a till in a shop, buy your goods and go away again, the relationship you have to the person operating the till. You might say hello to them, isn't the weather nice for this time of year, and be a bit polite and a bit of chit chat, but mainly you're just there to buy the goods and go again. And that's about it. It's focused on practicalities. The Gemeinschaftssociety, this tendency to tribalism and so on, tends to involve, or at least this is what Parsons argues, a much more multi-layered approach where, yes, you might have a task you're meant to achieve, such as at work or in education, but you tend to have, those kinds of societies tend to be much more community-oriented. People don't move around quite as often, so the person who is teaching you maths in the maths class maybe lives 10-minute walk up the road, and you might bump into them not only when you're in school learning with them, but you might be bumping into them on a daily basis. They may even be some distant third cousin twice removed of yours, and so you know them in lots of different contexts rather than just the one in the classroom. You know them in all sorts of other ways as well. Now, you could argue that to a point this can happen. I mean, you might quite like a particular teacher, and you might keep in touch with them after school or college or whatever it is, and that sort of thing. And you may, even in Western society, live somewhere near where your teacher lives and see them when you're out shopping. That kind of thing can happen clearly. But Parsons' argument is that in this society we tend to like to compartmentalise people. So when I've bumped into my bank manager at the train station, it takes me about 5 minutes to work out who the hell she is. And I sit there thinking I know her from somewhere, and then eventually the penny drops. And we are terribly English, and we sort of smile at each other and nod, and possibly say something about the weather, but that's about it. Because it somehow feels very awkward to suddenly see someone in a completely different context. And so there's no rush to friendship or to get to know each other or to say, oh, I like that new haircut you've got or whatever. There's none of that. It's quite role bound. Whereas you don't tend to get that in Gemeinschaft society. So this is Parsons branching out from the earlier elements of his ideas we were talking about to other areas. So he wrote tons of books about all sorts of things. So this is another example where he was thinking about how different societies run, and the fact that if we're thinking of functionalist institutions, in a Gesellschaft society, the institutions run in a Gesellschaft manner, and in a Gemeinschaft society, the institutions run in a Gemeinschaft manner. So how they operate, how they function, what purposes they serve, largely depends on which type of these two societies you're talking about in the first place. And you can be in the situation where, exactly like 21st century Britain, the majority of society is Gesellschaft, but there are certain sub-communities, which could be an isolated village, it could be a ghetto, where maybe practically everyone who lives in those 5 streets comes from the same ethnic community or the same religious community, and so they are seeing each other all of the day, maybe working with each other, maybe going to mosque or synagogue or temple or whatever it is with each other, and so they don't just know people in one context, they know them in lots of contexts, and so you've got a little mini Gemeinschaft community operating within a much larger Gesellschaft society. So you could potentially have a foot in both camps. Another of his ideas was referred to by this title of AGIL, AGIL. And he used AGIL to describe how social institutions like the church, the media, the military, etc., the things on the screen over, and lots of other things as well, how they operate and maintain themselves over a period of time. So A stands for adaptation, that all systems, if they're going to last any reasonable length of time, more than a 5-minute wonder, they will see changes going on in society around them. New technologies, migrations of people from one part of the world to another part of the world, a change in, big massive change in government, or a change in the dominant religion in a country. All sorts of things could happen, as well as things like wars and plagues and famines on the more grim side. If that institution is to survive, it must be good at adapting to these big changes. This is where we get some interesting questions with certain institutions. If any of you are Catholic, you might have direct experience of this already. So there is a heated and ongoing debate within the Catholic Church between its various different kind of subsections and communities, between those who think the Catholic Church should make certain changes, like whether or not there should be women priests, whether or not their view of gay people is the correct one, various other different arguments are made around different issues. And some people within the Catholic Church would like to see change made, because their argument is that the wider world has changed. Women are more liberated now than they were 500 years ago. Gay people are treated differently now than they were 500 years ago, etc. And therefore, the institution of the Catholic Church, they would like to see change and update itself accordingly. And other people, at the moment a much larger section of other people, say no, the Church should stay constant. It should stay true, it should resist adapting, because what was true 500 years ago is still true now. The fact that some people don't like it, well, tough luck on them. God's truth is eternal. It doesn't chop and change every time some social fad or trend comes along, because otherwise what's the point of having divine truth if it's changing every 5 minutes? And so there's that section that says change is bad because it's just trendy and faddy, and it makes the church look weak to suddenly start backtracking and so on. And there's another section that says, well, no, there are some things we need to go with the times on. And so you get conflicting views on what should or shouldn't happen in some institutions, at least, when it comes to issues like adaptation. The G stands for goal attainment. All institutions, Parsons argues, have goals, things they strive to achieve, they set out to do, and they've got to do at least some of it. If it takes them 500 years to achieve anything, then what's the point of the institution? Therefore, maybe they don't achieve everything in the first year, but as the institution goes on, there's got to be some sense that they are achieving at least some things which they set out to achieve. Otherwise, it will start to become irrelevant and break down. I stands for integration. In order to operate, Parsons says, all institutions, which could be something relatively small, the local branch of the WI, all the way up to something massive like the government, all systems have to have some kind of hierarchy to operate. Now, this is an area where during the radical feminism of the 60s and 70s, more so 70s, late 60s into the 70s, there were lots of dissenting voices that saw hierarchy as a peculiarly male thing, that in the envisioned brave new feminist world that they were dreaming about in the 60s and 70s, there would be no need for hierarchy. So not everyone agrees with this, but this is Parsons' view. How can you run something without a sense of who's in charge? And it's not just one person in charge, it's usually a kind of a delegating down. So this person is in charge of that bit and some other person is in charge of a different bit of the organisation. And there's a system of accountability of who does what where, who makes sure that goals are being attained, who kind of comes along and measures the success. Is it working? Is it doing what we want it to do? All of that sort of thing. And if it's a long-lasting institution, then obviously people get old, they die, they retire, they get ill, etc., and they need replacing, so there's got to be someone in to train up the next generation who are going to take on these roles and functions, and kind of keep it going from one generation to the next. And finally, the L stands for latency, which if that's not a word possibly some of you might not be familiar with. Latency is to do with the kind of sleeping and being inert, and a bit like a bear sleeping in a cave over the winter, a latency period, a period of inertia. This kind of contrasts to the A part of adaptation as two opposite sides, and brings us back to the Catholic example I gave at the start. If an organisation changes too much, will it lose all sense of its own identity? It's changed, it's changed, and it's changed to the point where it's no longer the same thing at all. It's now a totally different organisation than the one it started out as. In which case, does it kind of collapse in on itself because it's no longer the same thing, it's no longer real? Or does it need to keep a core which is unchanging, which is latent, which is kind of not asleep exactly, but is the heart of the organisation? So maybe the bits at the periphery, the bits at the edge can change, but the heart of the organisation has to stay the same. And that can include elements of hierarchy, in that if you are changing leadership every 3 months, I could name a couple of political parties here, but I won't. If you change your leaders, your administrators too quickly, then that sense of continuity falls apart. Whereas if you can keep them for a reasonably long time, then there is more opportunity to build up consistency, to keep core values, to ensure those core values are passed on to another generation, and so you have a sense of permanence. That idea, going back to the Catholic Church, of the Rock of Ages, which is the same thing for a very, very, very long time. And people know where they are with it because it's the same today as in your parents' time, your grandparents' time, your great-grandparents' time, etc. We could take an institution and think how AGIL would apply to it. which indeed is what I want you to do. Now, I know it says form pairs here. Something I'd like you to think about, and I'll randomly pick on someone, or actually I won't, I'll ask for volunteers. Next week when we're meeting in person, I might pick on maybe 2 or 3 pairs, and ask you to explain what you've been thinking about and discussing with each other in the intervening week. So at the moment, if you pick one of the things you've got there, the church, the banks, the BBC, some political party or another, or a particular trade union, and think about it in terms of the AGIL framework. So what is latent, what is adapting, and what are the hierarchies within that organisation and so on. Think about those different aspects as to how you understand one of these institutions, and then I'll ask some of you to share your ideas with the class next week. I won't ask everyone because that will take too long. But I'll ask a few of you to bounce your ideas around next week on that front. This rather long quote is from Parsons himself, towards the end of his life. "We must start with the assertion that all knowledge which purports to be valid in anything like the scientific sense presumes both the reality of the object known and of a knower. I think we can go beyond that and say that there must be a community of knowers who are able to communicate with each other. Without such a presupposition, it would seem difficult to avoid the pitfall of solipsism. The so-called natural sciences do not, however, impute the status of knowing subjects to the objects with which they deal." Now, that may not be the most readily understandable of quotes there. Some of those terms need explaining, and we'll do so. So we'll begin at the beginning. Seems a reasonable place to start. So we claim to know something. That's epistemology. What do we know? How do we know it? We think we know that the sun rises in the east and it sets in the west. That's something we can claim to know. And so when he says there about presumes both the reality of object known and of a knower, if I state the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, that presumes the sun really does exist. Now, obviously it does. This is a silly example, but let's run with it. It presumes the sun definitely exists, and that I'm not just hallucinating the sun, that it really is there. It's not a figment of my imagination. This is a real thing. But it also, in making the statement, the sun rises in the east, blah blah, suggests that there is someone, me, maybe somebody else, who has seen it happen. Not only does the sun exist, but there is definitely someone who has seen it happen. And if I'm the person saying the sun rises in the east, it kind of suggests that I'm the person. I mean, it might not be. I might be telling you something that somebody else told me. That's possible. But it kind of implies that I definitely exist in order to watch the sun rising in the east and set in the west. I'm going to try and avoid going all Buddhist on you and getting into questions about the reality of human existence and consciousness, but there is a little element of that the person who knows this thing really does exist. They're not just kind of... Much like if you waste your life on Facebook, the way I tend to do, you often see people posting memes, quoting statistics or making some statement. You know, Donald Trump said this, Joe Biden did that. And if you have the energy and the inclination to check, very frequently you find out it's not true. But someone says, I know this to be true. How do you know this to be true? Well, I read it somewhere else. Okay. How did the person who wrote it know it to be true? Well, they read it on somebody else's Facebook, and on it goes, and when you finally get to the root of the damn thing, it's not true at all. There is no one who knows this for an actual fact. There's someone who made it up, and then umpty thousand people who repeated it like parrots, believing it to be true, assuming it to be true, but not actually knowing clearly for a definite fact that it was true. The second bit of his quote about the community of knowers is that the vast majority, I think that sun rising in the east is a bit of a daft example, but the vast majority of things that we know aren't the sole discovery of a single person without any reference to anyone else whatsoever. So if we say we know penicillin is good in treating a number of illnesses, quite a large number of illnesses, how do we know this? Well, we can go back to the invention of penicillin, but that wasn't invented in isolation. The equipment needed to test whether penicillin would work had itself been made by other people, invented by other people, and once penicillin was tested and Louis Pasteur said, "I have found the penicillin," other doctors came along and tested it as well, and they said, "You are right, this is penicillin, it really does work," and a discussion went on. So even though one person found it, it involved a lot of other people making the equipment, developing the tests, doing the tests themselves to see did it work for this disease, that disease, some other disease. And so there was not one doctor, but a whole bunch of doctors, and not to mention the people who make the test tubes and the people who invented Bunsen burners and manufacture Bunsen burners in factories and all the rest of it, a whole ton of people involved in research into penicillin. That is the community of knowers. All of the people involved in developing, researching, studying, testing, learning, finding things out. And as Parsons says there, they are able to communicate with each other. They can speak a common language, or at least, find someone to help translate for them if they speak two different languages. They have the ability to write to each other, or speak to each other, or email each other, or do whatever the hell they're going to do with each other. So there's means there where they can meet up, share ideas, bounce them off, compare research, and so forth, in order to state that something is true. Where he's talking about solipsism, if that is an unfamiliar word, a solipsist is someone who believes that they are the only person in the entire world. Everyone else is a figment of their imagination. It's kind of the most massive form of egomania you can possibly imagine. The whole world is about me, I have dreamed the world into existence, nobody else exists. Except as a figment of my mind, my imagination. So he's saying, if you imagine that you and you alone have discovered something, that you and you alone know something, that no one else has had a role in it, contributed to it, helped with it, then you must have an ego on you the size of Mount Everest. You're living in solipsism, which is not a good place to live, and failing to appreciate that all knowledge exists in a community. And this is the kind of sociological element. It's saying knowledge doesn't just exist in the mind of one person. It's developed by lots and lots of people coming together, researching, studying, sharing, experimenting, inventing things, making things. Even the person who pushes the tea trolley around the laboratories is helping in the discovery of information and knowledge and learning. So everything we think we know is a result of lots of people coming together, not one super duper genius dreaming it up all by themselves without any help from anyone. Then he moves on towards the end of his quote, talking about the so-called natural sciences. That's things like chemistry and geology and physics, the study of the natural world and the physical world. However, they do not impute the status of knowing subjects to the objects with which they deal. How do we put this into terms? So if you've got a scientist who is doing some drug research by injecting dogs with some brand new veterinary medication to see if they get any better, the dog is the object that they are studying. It's the thing that they are studying. Does the dog get sicker? Does it get healthier? Does it, poor thing, die? What happens to the dog when the medication is injected into it? Now, I apologise to anyone who's a dog lover who's finding this sort of vivisection example a bit squirmy. Never mind. You'll survive. How does the dog experience the situation? Now, a subject, a knowing subject, is someone who is aware of what's going on. Now, clearly, when we're doing sociological research, you decide, right, you're going to go out and interview someone about, I don't know, their experiences of marriage. Let's go with that, seeing as we've mentioned marriage a little bit already. You know that the person you're interviewing is a person. They're real. They have thoughts and feelings and so on. They're not just this thing, this lump that you are conducting research upon. They can turn around to you and say, well, that's a really daft question. They can kind of unexpectedly participate in the research in different ways. They can critique your research by saying that's a daft question. They can refuse to answer one question and then start telling you about something you never asked them about in the first place. They're real, they're knowing, they're aware, they're engaging, and once the research is over with, they might be saying to you, well, I'd like to read whatever it is you've... Apologies for the phone, hang on. Sorry about that. This is the pitfalls of doing recordings at home. You get phones going off. Now, what were we on about? Blah, 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 blah. Yes, knowing subjects. So, that poor dog being injected in the laboratory, does it have thoughts? Does it have feelings? Does it have emotions? Does it have reactions? Well, it does. Anyone who owns a dog knows that. How well can it communicate that to the scientists conducting the research? That's a bit more of a confusing one. If you're injecting a human being with a medication, they can tell you if they feel better or worse. With a dog, you've just got to observe behaviours. The dog isn't going to turn around and go, woof, 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 I feel so much better. Or at least if it does, by and large, most humans don't understand what woof, woof, woof means. So there is a degree to which this can be a challenge to recognise the individuality of the thing you are studying in the natural sciences. An astronomer doesn't look up at the stars and see those stars as living beings. Now, in some religions they do, but most astronomers these days would not look on the stars as living beings with awareness and agency. They wouldn't think those stars know I'm looking at them with a telescope, I wonder how they feel about this. In the same way that as a sociologist, you know the person you're interviewing is aware that they're being interviewed. So this is perhaps an area where it's a bit murky within the natural sciences. Ought they regard the things they're studying as being aware subjects, rather than just objects, just things, just lumps to be studied? Or is this something peculiar to the social sciences like sociology and psychology and anthropology and so on, where we are very, very aware that we are studying, thinking, feeling, sapient, sentient people? That one is a bit of an open-ended discussion, which is still, even though that's a 1979 quote, that is still an ongoing area of somewhat heated discussion. Towards the end of this module, we'll get on to Donna Haraway, who is still with us, still living sociologist, who has quite strong views on that subject. So it's something we'll come back to towards the end of the module. So to return to some of the topics that you covered in the first year and just kind of revisit them and revive them a little bit. Epistemology, how do we know what we know? How are we sure we are going about conducting our studies in the correct way in order to find out what we want to find out about? This is something that Parsons says sociologists have to give a lot of thought to, because you are dealing with subjects, not objects. We are studying humans. Awkward, stroppy, difficult, cantankerous humans, with their own free will and choices and points of view. We are not studying inert lumps that just sit there. I mean, I grant you some humans are inert lumps, but by and large, most of them are not. Ontology. What do we understand about the reality of human existence? Whether in the big, grand, general way, or whether we're thinking reality of a particular issue, a particular topic, What is the reality of being a woman in 21st century Britain? What is the reality of being a man in 21st century China? What is the reality of being unemployed? Notions of ontology and what constitutes what. Can we define the terms and parameters of what we want to study effectively in order to then think about how to study it, the epistemology of how we're going to go and dig up reliable information about it. Positivist science, that kind of traditional natural sciences like geology and chemistry and biology, searches for objective knowledge, searches for a grasp of real things, facts about them that are unchallengeable, that are demonstrable, not just someone's opinion, but the notion of a fact as an objective thing which exists outside the realm of vague opinion. Positivists seek to develop theories and put those theories to the tests through experimentation and various other methods. There is an aim at measuring things. Biologists want to measure the body. Physicists might be measuring the interaction of atoms, amongst other things. Chemists will be measuring the interaction of various different chemicals. And in doing so, they'll use all sorts of techniques and statistics and correlations and random samples, so on and so forth. Durkheim, we'll get to him in a little bit more detail momentarily, but Durkheim argued that sociology would be better if a positivist approach could be developed towards the study of society. Could we start developing theories and testing them? Could we start measuring society, measuring changes? Could we come up with facts about society rather than just opinions? Parsons was open to considering this question in a number of different ways. You could momentarily take a breather, pause this video for a minute or two and think about whether you consider that society, sociology, can be studied in the same way that chemistry or biology or astronomy are studied, in that sort of objective, logical, theory developing, theory testing sort of a way. Or if you think they are very, very different, and society is such a difficult thing because we're studying people who are so confusing and ambiguous that we need a totally different approach. And then restart the video and you've had a think. I'm assuming you've restarted it. The alternative model, Parsons was quite keen on this model, is sometimes referred to as the interpretivist approach. To say that, well, stick with sociology for the moment, that humans are complex creatures full of opinions and views and quite vague emotions and feelings and notions and so on, that can be difficult to measure in any meaningful fashion, difficult to make absolutely categorical objective statements about, and requires therefore to have a subjective approach to treat humans as people rather than as laboratory rats or chemicals in a test tube. And so we have to use different methods like interviewing and ethnographic study and so on, and come up with theories, whether about massive grand things the way Marx did, or whether about much smaller scale topics, that reflect to us the nature of complex human experiences in which different people will have different attitudes, outlooks, views, different takes, different grasps of the situation. And interpretivist research needs to reflect that human element. So that's more where Parsons was coming down on that kind of interpretivist slant, although there were times when he kind of wanted to do the more positivist approach to research. Max Weber, who followed in the footsteps of Karl Marx, questioned whether the study of society can be quite the same as the study of chemicals and stars and biological functions, Because positivist science strives to be value-free, strives to be neutral when it approaches a subject, which Max Weber was German, so he uses German phrases. Wertfreiheit is the striving to be neutral and value-free. And what he conjectures, Weber, is that when it comes to the study of society and human nature and the human mind, that is remarkably difficult, because what you've got is one human studying another human. Not some inert chemical or lump of rock or whatever, but a complex, changing, fluid, moving human being, and the researcher is bringing their own humanity to the study of humans, because they are, at least in part, studying themselves in the process of studying other people. And this is value relevance, value relatedness, Wertbezogenheit, the wish to see certain forms of science, at least, and there are people like Donna Haraway, I mentioned earlier, who would argue this is true of most sciences, actually, not just sociology, but we'll keep the focus on sociology, that you have to bear in mind you as the researcher are a human being. You come with your own values, your likes, your dislikes, your hopes, your dreams, things you approve of, things you disapprove of, and so on, and that impacts your research. It can't not. And when you're interacting with other human beings, you are changing them, they are changing you in the very process of researching them, interviewing them, studying them, observing them. You have interactions going on which change values, and so you have to be upfront about your values. And it's much better for the research to be upfront, to state this is my bias, these are my prejudices, this is how it might affect my research. I'm making an effort not to let it, but I am a human being as a researcher. To take that into account. This sort of argument put forward by Weber is then echoed, Marx had said little bits of it already, but it's echoed particularly by Foucault, who advances the notion that in academia we have what he terms a regime of truth, a way of describing the world. So scientists describe the world in one way, chemists describe the world in one way, physicists describe the world in another, sociologists in another, psychologists in another. There are all these different, what to Foucault are elite bodies, a tiny number of people, highly educated, with the finances to access the education, back in his lifetime at least, these days of course through loans and so on. The means, the methods, the network of support, if we want to go back to Parsons, and this idea that it's not all just me, it's a bit of a group effort supported by family and friends and government and one thing and another to train up this body of highly educated people who know a lot about certain specific subjects like physics or biology or sociology or whatever it happens to be. And these people, they start to develop their own language. He doesn't mean French, German, Italian. He means jargon terms. They start bouncing around words and terms and phrases that anybody who is not a member of that group wouldn't understand half the time. And that's a way of keeping people out. To say, this knowledge is for us, it's not for you plebs, it's for us. We know what we mean, it doesn't matter if you don't know what we mean. And it's a bit of a kind of like creating a moat around yourself by using complicated words that other people outside your community don't understand, so they can't get across the moat unless you choose to explain those words to them. They'll have their own methods of research. So the way a chemist would research chemistry is different from the way a sociologist would research sociology. So their laws, if you like, their own way of understanding reality, their own way of understanding human beings and our place in reality, their way of putting knowledge to the test, developing concepts, developing ideas, is peculiar to that group. Now, it doesn't mean that other groups might not also study the same subjects, but in a very different way, and come to different conclusions. And then what you end up with is a clash between this elite group's way of doing it and that elite group's way of doing it. So let's take an example. Let's say you've got two groups of people thinking about the issue of homosexuality. And one group are biologists. And so they're looking into hormones, they're looking into neurochemicals, they're looking into various biological features that might lead one person to be gay and another person to be straight and another person to be bisexual and so on. And they're thinking in those terms, and they're taking samples of blood or samples of brain fluid and testing them, making arguments on that basis. And another group of people thinking about the same issue are priests. And so they're not taking blood samples and brain fluid and all the rest of it. They are perhaps turning to, if they're Christians, the Bible, or let's say it's a group of imams and they're turning to the Quran. They're reading Holy Scripture. What does this sacred book tell us about this issue? Let's have a prayer circle and sit and pray and see what the divine tells us and inspires us to think about this issue. So there are ways of understanding it. There are ways of trying to find out more knowledge about the issue and deepen their knowledge about the issue. The kinds of words and language and phrases they're going to bandy around will be very different between a group of imams or priests and a group of biologists. And the conclusions they come to might be the same or they might be different, it depends, but their way of arriving at whatever it is they consider to be the truth will be very influenced by their training, their backgrounds, their particular lifelong study of the world through a certain lens, a certain angle. They'll think in a certain way. Now, Michel Foucault was not interested in the question of who was correct. Were the priests right, or were the biologists right, or somebody else entirely? That didn't interest him. What interested him was observing the kind of power struggles that go on between different groups. When one group says, our answer is correct, and then the other group says, oh no, our answer is correct. And the kind of wrangles to say, well, we're better qualified to talk about this than you lot, because this subject has to be understood in this way, not in the way that you lot are going about understanding it. All of the kind of jostling for influence and for an audience of the wider public or of the government or whoever it is that they want to put their ideas to say, we know better about this subject than that other bunch of people over there. Therefore, you have to listen to our answers and not pay attention to their answers. You could say the same within a subject. So if you've got a group of Marxist sociologists and a group of feminist sociologists, they all come at the same subjects from somewhat different angles, using different terms, different jargon, and possibly different methods. They might be talking to different groups of people to conduct their research, their interviews, so on. And the Marxists will say, oh, we're right, the feminists are wrong, and vice versa. And you do get some people who are both Marxist and feminist at the same time. But you're going to get potentially a clash of highly educated elites about how best to understand whatever the topic is that they're discussing. Now, draw a breath, right. We'll touch very briefly on Kenneth Pike. We'll come back to him later on in the degree, but we'll touch on him briefly now. Kenneth Pike looked at styles of research and argued that there were two key styles of research in sociology and psychology and anthropology and these kind of related human sciences, which he termed emic and etic. Emic is the approach where you are studying an aspect of human nature that directly affects you. So it's basically you're studying a group that you are a member of. So if you've got a female sociologist, a woman sociologist, who wants to research into the role of women in the workplace. She's a woman, she has a job, she's researching other women who also have jobs. So not only is she listening to what they've got to say, she's interviewing them, so on and so forth, but all of the time she's doing that, she's also got her own life experiences to draw upon. And so she might be thinking, oh, this interview is nothing like my experience, or that interview is exactly the same as my experience. And so her own life experience is having a direct impact upon her research, because she's kind of researching herself in a way, in that she's researching a group of which she is also a member. Ethic is when you research a group that you're not a member of. So someone who's never ever been to prison in their life decides they're going to conduct some research on what it's like to be in prison, and they go and interview a bunch of prisoners and so on. They've got no background of their own to draw upon, they've never been in prison, they don't know, and therefore they're coming at it as an outsider. Pike argues that there are kind of strengths and weaknesses to both. If you do the emic research, you study the group you're a member of, you can be so immersed in the whole thing you don't see the wood for the trees, and you have these blind spots where you're so sunk in the experience you don't really have objectivity to think of it from a different angle. Or you've got such a personal investment, going back to Max Weber and his argument around values and being strongly invested in something. You're so desperate to get a particular answer that pleases you and supports your experience of life, that maybe that makes you blind to information that would contradict what you want to hear. The ethic approach, the outsider approach, has a lot more objectivity, so it doesn't have those kinds of problems. But you could argue, if you've never been into prison, how will you have any real understanding of what you're being told? You're reading these interviews, how do you know they're telling the truth? How do you know if they're ladling it on a bit, or exaggerating or underplaying? You've got no kind of insight. How do you even ask the right relevant questions in the first place if you lack any real understanding of the thing that you're trying to study? And so the ethic approach has its problems. Foucault's argument is that people with their specialisms tend to get very immersed in it, very set in it, and are very, without even knowing it half the time, very value-laden. And they're kind of quite biased in a lot of ways in terms of how they approach the study of a particular subject. There you've got a set of random memes that I nicked off the internet. Memes are a form of symbol, and symbolic interactionism, which we'll get into as we go along in the course, places a huge emphasis on understanding the role of symbols. Parsons was fascinated by symbols. The term meme for an internet-generated thing was coined by Dawkins. When he coined the term, he didn't coin it in regards to the internet, because it didn't exist back in 1976. Rather, he was thinking that this notion that just as genes in the body replicate themselves, and so certain hair colours or body shapes pass from generation to generation to generation, so he said ideas kind of leap from one mind to the next, to the next, to the next, and ideas replicate themselves in a similar kind of way to genes replicating themselves. If you're trying to understand the symbols of a culture, and symbols could be images, it could be songs, words, phrases, ways of dressing, ways of behaving, like shaking hands, that kind of thing, all has symbolic value to it. Do you need to be part of the culture? Do you need to be emic? Do you need to be in the culture in order to really understand it? So obviously I'm not an ancient Egyptian. I'm not that old. Feel it some days, but I'm not. If I am reading ancient Egyptian mythology and poetry and books and one thing and another, given that I'm not a member of that culture or that period of history, can I ever really understand the ways that people back then understood the symbols and the imagery in their mythologies and their artwork and so on? Can I ever really get it? This is a question that Mead and Cooley pose in studying symbolic interactionism, so we'll come back to them later on. It's also a question that Parsons himself contemplated. How well can you understand the symbolism of a culture that you are outside of, that you are a part from? Not an easy one to answer. Aaron Lynch developed ideas around the use of internet memes and how they're understood, how they kind of bounce around in terms of both imagery on the internet, but also how we pass on other forms of concept, idea, understanding and influence. I'm slightly pressed for time because I've got to do other recordings before I upload this one. So I think I'm going to park this one on the shelf, and I'll do a separate podcast later on around memes, and when I've got a little bit more time, and I'll upload it then so you can listen to it then. But essentially he argues there's lots of ways ideas effectively can pass from generation to generation to generation, and other elements in which ideas sometimes just die a death and disappear and are not effectively passed on from one generation to the next. But because of the pressures of time, I'll address this in a separate podcast for you. So if we're thinking about values and images and symbols, they all kind of overlap with each other. Symbols have a lot of underlying values and moral concepts to them, and values are often expressed in a symbolic way. And how do they pass from one generation to the next? We could say, for example, religion. Whichever religion, there's hundreds of them in the world, religions teach their set of values, and they encourage followers to bring their children to church or mosque or temple or synagogue, whatever it is, in order to learn the set of values, and it passes on to the young, who are then raised in it, and it becomes kind of a traditional thing. So there's formal teaching, like Bible study classes, or classes to study the Rig Veda, for example, in Hinduism. Politics, in a similar way, a lot of families, they might be very left-wing families or very right-wing families or very liberal families or what have you, will often discuss politics around the dinner table, and their kids hear, and they pick up on the values and beliefs of their parents. They don't always necessarily agree with them, of course, but they are at least exposed to them, they hear them, and it passes on from generation to generation. And we have party political broadcasts and politics programs on TV and articles in newspapers and on the radio and so on. So there's all sorts of different ways in which the values, be they political, religious or whatever else, are passed from one generation to the next, to the next, to the next. Not always successfully, and it's an interesting question to ask why it's not always successful. We can also think maybe in this day and age, this part of the world, where atheism is becoming much more common than it ever used to be, where there's no religious institution to pass on concepts and values, what alternative, different institutions are there to pass on values? And this again is part of Parsons' interest in the function of institutions. One of the functions of institutions is to pass on the values of itself to incoming new members, be they children or adults or whoever else. We could get in depth into the Christian ideas of individualism and individual salvation. We touched on that a little bit last week, so I'm not going to over-labour the point now. But there is an argument that our very notions of individualism in the modern West, I have a soul and it's important, me as an individual, whether I'm rich, poor or whatever I am, I have a value and importance in the eyes of God, and therefore I ought to have a value and importance in the eyes of other human beings. That notion arguably has led to individualism. And as we start to see the separation of church and state, what was a very religious value has now become a much more secular value, adhered to by people who have no particular religion or a totally different religion, or are even dead against religion, but nonetheless value the idea of individualism. And that, you could argue, in the West is a massively important value that we live with, and we'll start thinking about the impact of that as we go along in the course. There are strains within any institution. Parsons flags these up. The capacity for change versus the resistance, the unwillingness to change. That kind of going back and forth. And that strain, which could be over ideals, or it could be just a plain old-fashioned personality clash. That this person in an institution can't stand that person in an institution, and vice versa. Whatever the cause of the strain within a system, it can get bigger and bigger and bigger and cause a crisis. And that crisis needs resolving one way or another. The crisis might come through a resolution where, having considered do we change or do we stay the same, the decision is to stay the same. To conform, to go back to the traditional way of doing things, forget about this new faddy modern way of doing it, we'll stick with the old-fashioned way of doing it. Or it could move into what Parsons refers to as arrestation or isolation, where there is a kind of a halfway point where there is some change and some stability. So some things stay the same, but elements begin to change. There's a little bit of a change, a little bit of accommodation to the new ideas, the new way of doing things, but also a wish to hold on to a sizable chunk of the older way of doing things. And the third option is full change, where the old ways are ditched entirely and the new ways come in and come on board. Fairly obvious example, I'm not trying to teach you with a blackboard and chalk. I'm sitting here on my sofa talking to you over the internet. So we've adopted a wholly new way of teaching, taken it on board completely and ditched the blackboard and chalk in a past century. I'd encourage you to either pause the video and think about it, or maybe you might want to discuss this in class. I don't want this to turn into a rant and a rave between pro-Brexit and anti-Brexit, because that's just going to get nightmarish. But rather to think about not the rights and wrongs of Brexit itself, but to think about how the country appears to be changing. Is it, we've got this idea of either you go completely back to the traditional way of doing things, you have a halfway ground, or you go forward to a wholly new way of doing things. So how are we coping in Britain with the various strains of change? And you might want to think about this in respect to very specific areas of life, because otherwise it's going to be an unmanageable topic to think about the whole of life. How are we coping with change? Some things are being pushed to change, other things are being pushed to stay the same. Some things maybe are meeting halfway in the middle. How are we moving forward to this? Have a mull over it and we'll talk about it perhaps next time. Or when we have our team meeting and online meeting and chat about it. So back to Parsons and this concept of what constitutes a society. He argues that societies by and large are, well, usually quite large for the most part, and contain various collectives, different family units, for example, or different institutions, the police, the church, the mass media, etc. All of these various different subsystems which interact with each other, a bit like organs in the body. So you've got the heart, the lungs, the liver, they each do a different thing, but they all help to keep the whole body alive. So we can look at a society a bit like a body with lots of different organs or institutions within it. They each do their own thing, but they also contribute to the larger whole. The word primitive in the second paragraph there is in inverted commas because it's now considered a bit non-PC to use that term, a bit kind of patronising and condescending. But he argued that tribal societies, more old-fashioned types of societies, are usually physically much smaller. There are far fewer people in them. They're nowhere near as enormous as modern-day towns and cities. And so you tend to have things in those very small communities done on a family basis, because everyone is related in some way. They're cousins and aunts and uncles and nephews and whatnot. There's this interrelationship, and so they run as big kinship groups, big family groups, and operate in that way. But once you get to a certain size of population, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. There comes a point when you don't know the names of a lot of the people who live in the same town or city as you. You're not related to them. As mass migration comes in and people from different parts of the world come in, there isn't always that level of interrelationship going on between the different people. This box keeps appearing. This is done several times today in other recordings I've done. It will go away in a minute and the screen will return to normal. I say a minute, it's on now, isn't it? That part of his argument is that there is this process of differentiation that goes on as societies get bigger and bigger, and the distinctions between different institutions within society get more pronounced. So to give you an example of a very overt form of differentiation. Oh, come on. Turn that off. Anyway, to give you an example of a very overt form of differentiation, we have differentiation separation between church and state in this country, as they do in America and quite a lot of other countries, to say that the clergy are in one box and the politicians are in a different box, and whilst they might comment on each other, politicians might talk about religion perhaps, and bishops and archbishops and rabbis and whatnot might talk about politics, but nonetheless we tend to treat them separately, and to not expect there to be too much overlap between those institutions. They start to pull apart from each other, and even at the individualistic level, so not just in terms of very large institutions, but at a smaller scale individualistic level, people start to realise they can sometimes manage for a little while or longer periods by differentiating themselves from their family group, by differentiating themselves from their neighbours, so they don't all have to do the same thing. So whereas maybe in a very small community, maybe the entire family work on the farm, in a much larger community, some members of a family might work on the farm, but other members of family decide they want to go to college and learn to do mechanics or plumbing or carpentry or become a doctor or do whatever it is that they want to do. And so they start pulling in different directions, and that's when you start to get individualism beginning, because people are starting to think of themselves as different, both as individuals. I don't have to do what you do just because we're from the same family, but also as institutions, as groups. So our institution doesn't have to behave in the same way as your institution. So you could say, does the Bury St Edmunds College campus have to behave in the same way as the Ipswich campus? Or can we be distinct and different from each other and do things in different ways? That kind of a question. That in its turn can lead to segmentation. Segmentation is the breakdown of big groups into smaller and smaller groups and kind of subgroups to do more specialised tasks that are difficult to do en masse. That can happen in a very formal way, a decision to shard off. So, in a class I might say to you, right, I want you all to break down into groups of 3 and do this, so I am formally telling you to break down into a group of 3 and do something, which is different from what some other group of 3 is doing. Or it can happen in a more troublesome way. An example there is churches schismy. So there's a big rift, and one group in the church says, we think you're wrong about this doctrinal issue. Right, we are so annoyed with you, we're going to go off and form our own church and never talk to you again. And off they go, and they create a totally separate church. So rather than a decision from the top, right, we want you to do this and you to do that and form two different groups, rather it happens as a more kind of hostile reaction as people rift apart. And as far as Parsons is concerned, that rifting tends to be quite destructive and causes a lot of problems in the long run. Better it is to be managed from the top, he says. And then from that state we move into specification. As these smaller groups, as assuming they have moved apart in a formal sense because someone at the top has directed them to move apart, nonetheless are aware that even if they are specialising in very particular things, which other members of their organisation aren't, that they nonetheless are still members of the same organisation. So there is an attempt to retain core values, that we're still basically all part and parcel of the same overarching thing, and kind of come together. So the Church of England has, I don't know how many hundreds, probably thousands of churches the length and breadth of the country. Individual churches of St Anne's, St Luke's, St this, St that, St the other. They are all individual churches, local congregations, local ways of doing things, but they're still part of the same big organisation, and so have to have the same set of core values, because if they don't, they will eventually drift off entirely and become wholly separate. And there's an ongoing issue in terms of how do you maintain core values and continuity with the bigger group when you're off in one of these smaller groups, so that you don't drift and drift and drift until you become wholly separated, wholly isolated. One thing that Parsons was interested in, which we'll mull over in a future lesson, is the idea to which your identity as an individual, your sense of who I am. So if you're sitting there saying, I am Robert, I am Colleen, I am this person, I am Joe Bloggs, then is your sense of self born entirely out of you, or is a lot of it formed by your group membership? Maybe even not just a lot of it, but practically all of your sense of self is a coagulation of the various different social groups you belong to, and how they have shaped and formed and influenced your sense of who you are as an individual. So if you weren't in any social groups, would you even still have a sense of your own individuality left? Which is a question we'll mull over in the future weeks. Briefly leaping on to Durkheim, and again I'm quite conscious of the passage of time, so we'll try and deal with this quickly. Durkheim argues that deviance within society exists in positive and negative capacities. You can have forms of deviance that are entirely destructive, but you can also have forms of deviance that are actually quite useful, because what they do is start to innovate. What starts off as a minority cranky kind of a thing eventually becomes mainstream, as that unusual idea or way of thinking about things, way of doing things, becomes gradually a little more and more popular, until it becomes accepted and is no longer labelled as deviant, because it's eventually grasped as having some positive value, even if once upon a time it wasn't seen in quite such an upbeat life. The example you've got on the screen, that being gay, I know a lot of people still don't like gay people, are still quite hostile, but generally speaking, British society is far more tolerant now than it was 200 years ago. What was seen as disgusting and dirty and filthy 200 years ago, probably the majority of society these days in Britain wouldn't bat an eyelid if they discovered some friend, some relative, some next door neighbour was gay. They'd think, oh well, so what? And it wouldn't be reacted to in the way it once was. So it's not gone mainstream in the sense that suddenly everyone is gay, but rather it's gone mainstream in the sense that it's no longer viewed as a negative deviance the way it used to be once upon a time. He also says that even the negative, destructive, unpleasant forms of deviancy can serve a use because they bring other people together. So we can all come together and point the finger at someone as revolting as Jimmy Savile and go, oh God, that's disgusting, what an awful, terrible person. aren't we glad we're not like him? Isn't it dreadful? I bet there are other people like him in the world. And whilst we're sitting around pointing the finger at him, the side effect of that is that we come together. It bonds us because we're not them. And you might be able to think of your own examples or of similar kinds of things where the revulsion against a very destructive form of deviance serves to bring everyone else together and create a common bond and a common unity, opposing and against the outsider, the destructive, the dangerous, the negative other. And we'll get on to talking about othering in the future weeks, which is a sociological concept some of you are probably, I dare say, already familiar with. Now, next week, we'll develop more on Durkheim, Marx and Weber's ideas and look at them from different angles. We'll also look at another German sociologist, Jörg Simmel, who had various ideas around symbolic interactionism and related concepts, and use some of his ideas and a couple of other ideas from other researchers to think of the symbolic nature of money and how we understand money. And so the idea that an hour of my time might have a monetary value on it, and so there's a kind of symbolic relationship between time and money, between activity and money, between an object. How much money is this loaf of bread worth? Between the object and money, and what we can do with money and how we can use money and all that sort of thing. So we'll go into that next week, and hopefully you'll find that reasonably interesting, when of course we will be meeting back in class in the flesh. Woohoo! And finally we'll mention a little bit about the Frankfurt School, which was a big German school of sociology that still has a major influence on the world of sociology and to some extent on the world outside of sociology. So we'll explore those concepts as we go. But deep breath, I'll leave that here for now because I've got to go and do some other recordings on other classes. We'll have the meetup for the chat online on whatever day of the week is, Wednesday. And if you've got questions or you want to put your 2 pennyworth worth in about something, please join in. That'd make it lovely. If you're really busy or there's absolutely no questions you want to ask because you're happy with what you've heard so far, then fair enough. But the opportunity will be there for you if you do want to take part and discuss. We'll try doing it through Microsoft Teams. I have had a couple of problems with that this last week or so. Technical glitches, so if it really goes pear-shaped, we'll end up, I think, probably doing it through a different platform, maybe something like virtual classrooms on Brightspace, but we'll try Microsoft Teams to start with. Thank you.